Two racist and corrupt cops arrested the wrong black woman. They abused their power, slammed her against her car, cuffed her without reading her rights, and laughed in her face as they called for backup. They thought they had her. They thought she was just another nobody. But what they didn't know was who she was married to. What happened after that call changed everything, not just for her, but for them. And what those two officers lost that day shocked an entire city. It started like any other quiet weekday afternoon. A woman sat alone in her car, just outside a suburban grocery store, waiting for her friend to come back with a smoothie. The engine was off. Windows halfway down. Sunglasses on. Not bothering anyone. Just scrolling through her phone, reading emails. That was all it took. That was all it took for a white woman across the parking lot to feel threatened. She picked up her phone and called 911. Claimed the woman matched the description of someone who had robbed a small electronics store earlier that day. Claimed she looked nervous. Claimed she had that look in her eye. That was all it took for two officers to rush to the scene like it was a manhunt. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look at the footage from the store across the street. They didn't compare descriptions or check her license plate. No, they pulled up hard, parked crooked, and approached her car like she had a gun in her lap. She barely had time to look up before she heard the aggressive knock on her window. "Get out of the car. Hands where I can see them." Confused, she raised her hands. "What's going on? What did I do? Step out now. This is your last warning." The fear set in fast. The tone. The body language. One cop had his hand on his holster. The other had already unclipped the taser. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," I said out of the car. They yanked her door open, pulled her out, pushed her against the vehicle so hard it rattled, zip-tied her wrists behind her back. Her phone fell and cracked on the pavement. Her purse spilled. Her sunglasses snapped. All the while, one of them was muttering sarcastically, "Yeah, real innocent. Just sitting here casing the place, huh?" People were watching. A few had their phones out. But nobody stepped in. Some stared. Others walked away quickly, pretending not to see. She asked them again, pleading this time. "Can you at least tell me what this is about? You match a suspect in an earlier theft. That's all you need to know right now. But I've been here for 20 minutes, tell it to the judge." And then the laughter. The kind that slices deeper than any insult. One officer chuckled and said, "Look at this, Gucci bag, Tesla key. Might have stolen those too, huh?" The other one leaned closer, whispering with fake sympathy, "Should have picked a better neighborhood. You don't exactly fit in here." That's when something inside her broke. Not out of fear. But out of rage. Silent, burning, controlled rage. She wasn't just some woman they could toss around. She had spent her entire life holding herself to a standard higher than they could ever understand. Discipline. Education. Integrity. And now, she was being thrown around like a criminal for doing nothing more than waiting in a car. With her wrists still restrained and her breath shaky, she turned slightly and managed to reach her damaged phone with the tip of her foot, pressing it just enough to activate voice control. One name. One command. That's all it took. And he answered on the first ring. No hesitation. No confusion. Just one sharp command on the other end of the line, "Send me your location. Now." What happened next, not even the cops saw coming. Within minutes, 3 black SUVs with government plates rolled into the parking lot. Uniformed military officers stepped out, calm, direct, and in control. The lead man walked up to the arresting officers without saying a word, just showing a single badge. A Pentagon emblem. Top-level clearance. The entire air shifted. The laughter stopped. The smirk disappeared. One of the officers tried to explain, said she matched a suspect. That they were just doing their job. But it was too late. The military man didn't even speak to them. He walked straight to the woman, still zip-tied, trembling, with bruises on her wrist. He knelt beside her and whispered, "I'm here. I've got you." And from that moment on, they lost control. What unfolded in the next 24 hours left the entire precinct in chaos. Complaints were filed. Video footage surfaced. Internal Affairs was called in. Federal oversight was requested. And the officers, the ones who thought they were untouchable, suddenly found themselves at the center of a national scandal. But that wasn't even the end. Because what those officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known, is that their victim wasn't just connected. She was powerful. Respected. And she was tired of staying silent. She was about to become a voice louder than anything they had ever tried to suppress. The real question is, how far did she go to make sure justice was served? And what exactly happened to the two men who humiliated her in public that day? Stay until the end of the story to find out. Before we start today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This channel supports justice, equity, and the dignity of every human being, especially those who've been historically silenced or mistreated. If you've ever been overlooked, judged, or discriminated against just for being who you are, please know, you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Now, let's dive into a story that needs to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and join a community where truth and justice matter. Enjoy the story. The morning in Ferguson, Missouri, began like most others, humid air clinging to the skin, the sky still undecided between gray and gold, and the neighborhood pulsing with a familiar rhythm, school buses making their rounds, kids clutching cereal bars as they ran out the door, parents balancing coffee cups with briefcases. But for Tamika Harris, it was a morning she had marked on her calendar weeks in advance. She had cleared her schedule, canceled 2 business meetings, and promised her daughter they'd celebrate with pizza and strawberry milkshakes once it was over. Her best friend was finally closing on her first home, and Tamika had agreed to drive her to the notary office, wait while she signed the paperwork, and then help her pick out curtains and paint swatches. It wasn't just an errand. It was a promise between women who had built each other up through breakups, layoffs, heartbreaks, and now, triumphs. Tamika wasn't just another face in the crowd. At 38, she had a presence that walked into a room long before she did. Sharp brown eyes that scanned every detail, skin the color of rich espresso kissed by years under the southern sun, and a posture that suggested both pride and preparedness. She carried herself with a balance between warmth and watchfulness, the kind of woman who smiled at strangers but read body language like a language of survival. Her style was timeless, high-waisted tailored pants, crisp blouses, natural curls pulled into a bun, minimal gold jewelry that spoke of elegance, not extravagance. And her Tesla? It wasn't about showing off. It was about reliability, safety, and a quiet defiance in a world that still questioned what someone like her could afford to drive. A St. Louis native, Tamika had worked her way from the chaos of public schools and overcrowded classrooms to a position as a communications executive at a leading biotech firm. Her path hadn't been easy. She had raised her daughter, Imani, largely on her own, while juggling night classes and temp jobs. But she made it. And now, life felt steady. Maybe not peaceful, not yet, not in a world where she still got followed in stores or called articulate like it was a surprise, but stable. Her home was in a modest gated community just outside Ferguson, where the lawns were neatly trimmed and the mailboxes all looked the same. People waved when they drove past, but didn't stop to chat. That suited her just fine. She preferred meaningful connections over small talk anyway. Her husband, Colonel Nathaniel Harris, was another story. To the outside world, he was steel. 6 feet 3 inches of disciplined silence, clean lines, and black and white thinking. Head of strategic operations at the Pentagon, he had the kind of career that required clearance codes and conversations behind closed doors. But to Tamika, he was softness tucked inside armor. The man who warmed her coffee before she woke up. The man who sat through every school play with tears in his eyes, even if he had to fly in straight from D.C. in full uniform. They met in college, a brief exchange in the student union turned into a late-night study session, then a 5-year courtship marked by cross-country moves and one impossibly romantic proposal under a cherry blossom tree in Maryland. Nathaniel's work meant he wasn't home as much as he wanted, but he was present in every way that counted. And Tamika? She was the calm to his storm, the measured voice behind every decision. They didn't just love each other. They respected each other, a kind of love that didn't need proving. That morning, Tamika dropped Imani off at middle school with a kiss and a warning about watching TikTok during class. She picked up her friend at 9:45 sharp, and they stopped for smoothies at a new black-owned cafe downtown. Her friend ran inside to grab the order, while Tamika parked the car and waited in the lot across from a hardware store. She responded to emails, checked her planner, and hummed along to an old Anthony Hamilton song playing low through the speakers. Nothing about her posture was threatening. Her car was parked legally. Her ID was in her purse. And still, someone saw her and decided, she didn't belong. Across the lot, a white woman pacing with her cell phone hesitated, glancing at Tamika's car, then whispering into the receiver. The police dispatch log would later show, she said, there's a suspicious vehicle. A black woman alone. She looks nervous. Might be on something. No crimes had been reported in the area that morning. No BOLO alerts. But the words black woman and suspicious together were enough. Enter Officer Blake Withers and Officer Jared Connors, both in their mid-40s, both with 10 years on the Ferguson PD, and both riding the kind of unchecked power that came from years of skating under the radar. Their personnel files were thick with informal complaints, excessive force, unprofessional conduct, racial profiling, but nothing had ever stuck. The blue wall held. Always. Blake, with his slick-back hair and tight jaw, carried an air of superiority like cheap cologne. Jared was more silent, more calculating, but his silence was never kindness, it was a smokescreen. They didn't patrol this side of town often, but when they did, they made their presence known. When they pulled in, sirens off but lights flashing, Tamika looked up, puzzled but calm. She rolled down her window, unsure if someone had hit her parked car or if they were searching for someone. She had no fear. Why would she? Her entire life had been built around staying ahead of suspicion. She knew the rules. Dress well. Speak clearly. Keep your hands visible. But some rules only apply when people are playing fair. The officers didn't ask her name. They didn't introduce themselves. Instead, Blake barked the order. Step out of the vehicle. Tamika blinked, confused. Excuse me. Now. Step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm waiting for my friend, she just went into. Jared was already opening her door. You fit the description of a suspect from this morning. Don't make this harder than it has to be. What description? I've been parked here 10 minutes. I haven't moved. Her voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. Not because she was guilty, but because she knew how these things went. She tried to reach for her phone, but Blake knocked it out of her hand. The screen cracked on impact. Keep your hands where we can see them. They yanked her out. Her back hit the hood of her own car. Her arms were twisted behind her and zip-tied too tight. Her chest was pressed against cold metal. Her purse fell open. Lip balm, receipts, gum, spilled out like artifacts. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. But inside, something snapped. The worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't even the way people stared and filmed, or the two teenagers whispering and pointing from across the lot. It was the voice in her head, the one that kept asking how many degrees do I need? How many laws do I have to follow? How much proof do I need to be safe in my own skin? And that's when the silence broke. What are you doing? She didn't do anything. Her friend had come out of the cafe just in time to see the moment her hero, her rock, was being treated like a criminal. But her voice was drowned out by police radio, by Jared's dismissive tone, by the clack of handcuffs and the static of power being misused. This moment, this snapshot of public humiliation, injustice, and racial profiling, would become the catalyst. It would be the moment that ignited a storm the officers could never have imagined. Because Tamika wasn't alone. She never had been. And the man on the other end of that cracked phone? He wasn't just a husband. He was a strategist trained to eliminate threats. Not violently. Strategically. Methodically. Permanently. And the question that would soon hang over this entire town was no longer why did it happen. It was how far would she go to make sure it never happened again. The parking lot had become a stage. Not for justice. Not for order. But for humiliation. Tamika stood in silence, zip-tied and exposed, while Officer Blake filled out paperwork like he was writing a parking ticket. Jared leaned against the hood of their patrol car, chewing gum with indifference, his eyes occasionally glancing at the onlookers recording on their phones. The laughter had stopped, but the damage had already been done. Tamika's wrists throbbed from the plastic ties, her blouse was wrinkled and stained from the hood of her car, and a sharp knot had formed in her stomach, not from fear, but from rage. She had held herself together for every minute of the interaction, had not once raised her voice, but now that her friend stood beside her pleading for answers, the shame settled deeper. Not because she felt guilt, but because she had been made into a spectacle. A lesson. An example of what could happen, even when you did everything right. Her friend, Monica, was trembling, half from anger, half from helplessness. She stood between Tamika and the officers, hands raised slightly as if her words might be mistaken for aggression. You're making a mistake. She didn't do anything. You didn't even ask for her ID. You just pulled her out of the car like some. She cut herself off before the word could escape. Criminal. It wasn't just what they thought Tamika was. It was how they wanted everyone around to see her. Blake barely looked up from his clipboard, muttering, "We've got protocol. This fits a suspect from a 211 reported this morning. We'll sort it out downtown." His tone dripped with arrogance, as if he knew he was protected by an invisible shield. Jared stepped forward, his voice cold and even. "You need to step back, ma'am. We're handling this." Monica shook her head slowly, then looked at Tamika, her eyes full of apology, of disbelief. "Do you want me to call?" she began, but Tamika nodded subtly. No words needed. Just that nod. That silent cue. Because Tamika already had. By the time the black SUVs turned into the lot, the sun was higher in the sky and the parking lot had grown quieter. People had stopped recording, some had left, but the tension still lingered in the air like smoke. The moment the vehicles appeared, everything shifted. The insignia on the plates, the formation of the uniformed personnel exiting with calm precision, none of it matched the chaotic energy the officers had brought minutes earlier. The man who stepped out of the lead vehicle didn't yell. He didn't raise his hands or flash a badge like on TV. He simply walked with purpose, with knowledge, and with power. Every step said, "I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I'm here to do. And I know exactly what you've done." Nathaniel's face was unreadable, but his eyes scanned everything. Tamika. Her bruised wrists. Her crumpled bag on the ground. The expressionless face of Officer Blake. The slight tension in Jared's jaw. Nothing escaped him. He didn't ask questions. He gave orders. He motioned to his security detail. Two broke off toward the police car. Another approached Tamika gently, a pair of trauma shears in hand, cutting the zip ties from her wrists without a word. She winced slightly, but didn't speak. Nathaniel came to her side, touched her hand, then turned back toward the officers. The conversation that followed wasn't loud, but it was seismic. "You have violated protocol on multiple levels," Nathaniel said, voice low but unmistakably sharp. "You had no warrant. No probable cause. No ID verification. You detained a civilian in public without justification." Blake tried to interrupt, voice suddenly an octave higher. "Sir, we received a dispatch call describing." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Was that dispatch from a verified source? Did you confirm the report? Did you check the timestamp?" Jared took a step forward, nervous now. "We're just doing our job." Nathaniel stepped closer, towering over him. "Your job. Your job is to serve and protect. Not to harass, humiliate, and violate." It wasn't just the words. It was the way the crowd had returned. The way phones were back up in the air. The way Monica stood nearby, streaming the whole thing live. People weren't just watching. They were listening. And this time, they would remember. A few minutes later, 2 unmarked federal vehicles joined the scene. Men and women in suits, not uniforms, stepped out. IDs flashed. Questions asked. Forms passed. The officers were separated, taken to the side, questioned. For the first time, their confidence faltered. The shield was cracking. Tamika sat in the back of the SUV now, sipping cold water and breathing deeply, her wrists wrapped in gauze. Nathaniel sat beside her, eyes scanning the window, never resting. "I should have been here sooner," he said, voice low. She shook her head. "You were here when it mattered." He touched her hand. "This isn't over." She knew it wasn't. And in that moment, neither of them were thinking about retaliation. They were thinking about accountability. Back at the station, Officer Blake paced the hallway, phone pressed tight to his ear, calling his union rep, his supervisor, anyone who could make this go away. Jared sat silently in an interrogation room, staring at the floor. They both knew this wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was different. There were too many witnesses. Too many cameras. Too many questions. Later that night, Nathaniel and Tamika sat at their kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Imani had gone to bed after a long hug and an explanation she only half understood. Nathaniel scrolled through a document on his secure tablet, incident reports, protocol breaches, official language that now told her story in bullet points. "They're scrambling," he said. "They're trying to spin it. Say you were non-compliant." Tamika looked at him, fury flaring behind her calm. "I want my voice heard. I want my name cleared. And I want them to know that next time, it won't end with zip ties. It'll end in court." The next morning, her inbox was flooded. Videos of the arrest had gone viral. Journalists reached out. Activists offered support. And then came the threats. Anonymous messages. Comments under videos. Reminders that for every voice that speaks, there are 10 more trying to silence it. But Tamika didn't waver. She met with attorneys. She spoke to reporters. She wrote a statement. And she stood in front of a courthouse 3 days later, microphone trembling slightly in her hand, as she spoke. "I am not a suspect. I am not a criminal. I am a mother. A wife. A citizen. I was humiliated in broad daylight because someone decided my skin made me dangerous. I will not be quiet. I will not be invisible. Not anymore." The applause was immediate. The headlines the next day read, "Pentagon officer's wife victim of racial profiling," but that wasn't the real story. The real story was still unfolding, just beneath the surface. Because what the public didn't know yet, what the officers didn't see coming, was that Tamika wasn't just planning to sue. She was building a case so airtight it would expose a decade of misconduct inside the Ferguson PD. She had names, patterns, video, and one federal ally who wasn't afraid to use his rank for justice. And when the final piece of evidence surfaced, the one detail that would link these two officers to a string of unlawful arrests, it would blow the entire department wide open. But no one knew that yet. Not even them. The first sign that something bigger was happening came quietly. A late-night email. Then another. And another. Tamika sat at her dining room table, the silence of the house broken only by the occasional clink of her teacup against the saucer. Nathaniel was upstairs reviewing a secure file. Imani had fallen asleep on the couch after watching a documentary Tamika hadn't had the heart to turn off. But her screen was lighting up. A law student from St. Louis sent her a file with timestamps of prior incidents involving Officer Blake. A single mother from a neighborhood near downtown messaged her detailing how she was pulled over and humiliated in front of her kids for a broken taillight that didn't exist. A former officer, now retired, anonymously emailed a report titled Unfiled Complaints, with screenshots of internal memos that had been quietly buried. The thread was unraveling. The next morning, in a windowless office inside a private law firm downtown, Tamika sat with her attorney, Danielle Rhodes, a no-nonsense civil rights litigator with sharp eyes and a colder mouth. "This is no longer about one wrongful arrest," Danielle said, laying out folders like pieces of a chessboard. "This is a pattern. What they did to you wasn't just misconduct. It was part of a culture, and they've gotten away with it because no one had the power to make it stick." Tamika leaned forward, her voice low. "We do now." By the end of the week, the case had a shape. Tamika wasn't the only one. At least 7 individuals had come forward with credible claims, and Danielle had pulled their records. Citations without due process. Video footage with missing segments. Language and police reports that sounded almost identical across years. It was a script, one written to frame people like her as dangerous, non-compliant, unpredictable. But the script was about to be shredded. At home, Nathaniel paced in his office, phone pressed to his ear. "No, I'm not asking for interference. I'm asking for cooperation," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "Yes, within legal boundaries. I'm fully aware of the line and I won't cross it. But don't insult my intelligence by pretending this isn't systemic." There was a pause, then a clipped reply, "Understood. I'll handle it." That night, as Tamika folded laundry in the living room, Nathaniel sat beside her, holding a flash drive between his fingers. "You need to see this," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "Where did that come from?" He didn't answer directly. "A friend in the Department of Justice owed me a favor. Internal audit footage. 6 months' worth of body cam files they never submitted in court." She stopped folding, heart suddenly tight. "You're sure it's legal?" He nodded once. "As long as we don't leak it. But your lawyer can request it in discovery now that it's known to exist." He handed her the drive. "Just, be ready. It's worse than we thought." The footage played late into the night. Some of it was shaky. Grainy. But the audio was clear. The voices unmistakable. One clip showed Blake approaching a parked car in the same lot where Tamika had been arrested, speaking to another black woman, who was visibly shaking. "We've had complaints," he said in the video, voice dripping with condescension. "You people need to understand how this neighborhood works." In another, Jared was seen laughing with a colleague in the break room, mocking someone's accent after a traffic stop. "I swear, man, it's like they all read from the same book when they get scared." Tamika watched without blinking. Every word was a weight pressing down on her chest. Every timestamp was a receipt. She turned to Nathaniel, voice calm but brittle. "They don't just act like this. They talk like this. Proud of it." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The final push came days later. Danielle arranged a closed-door meeting with the city's Civil Oversight Board, presenting the compiled evidence. She moved like a surgeon, precise, calculated, deadly. When the board saw the footage and heard the testimonies, the room went silent. The chairperson, a stern woman named Judge Palmer, asked only one question: have the officers been notified? Danielle shook her head. Not yet. We wanted this body to see it first. If we go public, they'll lawyer up. We want them caught off guard. The trap was set. That afternoon, Ferguson PD held a press conference attempting to control the narrative. Chief Miller, whose tenure had already been marred by scrutiny, stood stiffly at the podium. We're aware of the public's concern and are conducting an internal review, he said. But minutes later, as reporters began asking about the leaked footage circulating online, footage showing Officer Blake slamming a young man against a police car for allegedly resisting, footage with audio exposing Jared mocking suspects, the tone changed. At home, Tamika sat with Danielle, eyes fixed on the television. The footage had spread. News anchors repeated her name, not as a suspect, but as a survivor. As a voice. As a catalyst. She turned the volume down when her phone buzzed, a message from a former coworker she hadn't spoken to in years: "You're brave. And you're not alone." 2 days later, formal charges were filed. Misconduct. Falsification of reports. Use of excessive force. Both officers were placed on unpaid leave. But what no one expected, not the department, not the press, not even Tamika, was what came next. The Pentagon. Nathaniel had remained silent publicly, but he had been working. Coordinating with federal investigators, compiling documentation, and quietly ensuring that every legal path was followed. And now, the investigation into Officer Blake and Jared had extended beyond Ferguson. Because one of their arrests, an immigrant father pulled over and deported after false charges, had violated federal policy. There was now a federal inquiry into civil rights violations. The kind that didn't end with a desk job. The kind that ended with prison time. Tamika stood in the hallway outside the courthouse on the day of the hearing, watching as Blake and Jared were escorted in separately, avoiding cameras, heads low. Reporters swarmed, but she stayed still. Calm. Monica stood beside her, holding her hand. "You ready for this?" she asked. Tamika nodded. "They made a mistake. Not just with me. With all of us. And now, they get to answer for it." Inside the courtroom, the judge didn't smile. She didn't scold. She simply read the charges with a tone that left no room for negotiation. Tamika's statement was read into record. A collective testimony from those who had come forward. The footage played. And for the first time, the power was not in the hands of the uniform. It was in truth. In proof. In presence. The tension wasn't from shouting or outbursts. It was in the silence. In the way the courtroom leaned forward. In the way Blake's face lost its color. In the way Jared's hands shook as the audio of his voice, mocking, cruel, echoed through the speakers. And when the judge looked up and said, "There is clear and compelling evidence that the defendants knowingly violated the civil rights of multiple citizens under the color of law," the gasp in the courtroom was collective. The storm wasn't coming. It had arrived. The courtroom was a vacuum of breath, thick with judgment, memory, and the weight of years collapsing into this singular moment. Tamika sat still, her hands gently folded in her lap, but her heart pulsed like thunder beneath her blouse. Nathaniel was one row behind her, his posture straight as a blade, jaw clenched with the quiet tension of a man who'd waited a lifetime to watch a system turn on itself. Monica was on her right, fingers tightening around hers every time the prosecution brought up another name, another story, another wound that had bled too long without justice. The judge's voice was steady, but the air around it shifted, trembled, grew heavier with every word read aloud from testimonies collected, corroborated, and finally believed. At the defense table, Blake stared ahead, eyes glassy but empty, as though his mind had checked out hours ago. The arrogance that once dripped from every smirk, every dismissive shrug, was gone now, dried up and replaced by something quieter, more desperate. Jared shifted constantly in his seat, tapping his fingers against the wood, avoiding every gaze in the room. His lawyer whispered to him, but he didn't nod, didn't respond. The sound of his own voice from the recordings, played earlier, cruel, mocking, unfiltered, had reduced him to a man unraveling. The silence of accountability was louder than any protest he could make. Then came the moment the prosecution had held back. The final witness. Danielle stood slowly and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Ms. Tamika Harris to the stand." A low stir rose across the gallery. Tamika took a slow breath, rose from her seat, and walked forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the calm of someone who knew the truth had never needed to shout to be heard. The bailiff swore her in. She adjusted the microphone and sat, her back straight, her voice steady but charged with every ounce of emotion she had held inside for far too long. "When I was zip-tied against my car in broad daylight," she began, her voice echoing in the stillness, "I wasn't just stripped of my freedom. I was stripped of my dignity. Of my humanity. I wasn't a suspect. I wasn't a threat. I was a black woman in a nice car in a neighborhood that didn't see many of us. That was the crime I committed that day. That's what they punished me for." She didn't look at Blake or Jared. She looked at the jury. At the judge. At every camera lens that would carry her words into homes across the country. "I stayed calm. I didn't fight. I followed every command. But it didn't matter. Because they weren't there to find the truth. They were there to find someone to blame. And I was convenient. I was available. I was disposable. And I'm standing here to tell you, I am not disposable." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she didn't pause. She didn't apologize. She let the weight of it land. Nathaniel had never taken his eyes off her. There was no pride in his expression, just a depth of emotion he'd never had the words for. Because this wasn't just about what they had done to his wife. It was about what they had tried to take, from her, from him, from their daughter. The defense attempted a weak cross-examination, leaning into the dispatch report, the matching description, the confusion of the moment. But Tamika held her ground. "I understand fear," she said. "I've felt it every day since I was old enough to realize that the color of my skin made people nervous. But your fear doesn't justify my suffering. Your confusion doesn't erase my reality." When she stepped down, there was no applause. Just silence. Respectful, powerful silence. The kind that only comes when truth has carved through the noise and left everyone breathless. Later that day, the court recessed, and Tamika, Nathaniel, and Danielle stepped into a private conference room. The tension hadn't lifted, not yet, but something had shifted. "They're losing grip," Danielle said, pulling out a folder with signatures. "2 more officers just agreed to give statements in exchange for immunity. They're turning on each other." Nathaniel didn't react outwardly, but Tamika saw the flicker in his eyes. The calculation. The silent victory. "I don't want immunity deals," she said carefully. "I want them to take responsibility. Publicly." Danielle looked up. "This is leverage. We can make that part of the deal. Public apology. Permanent dismissal. Forfeit of pensions. And full cooperation in the federal inquiry." Tamika nodded slowly. "Then make it happen. They took my peace. I'm going to take their silence." That night, in their living room, with the city outside holding its breath, Nathaniel poured them both glasses of wine and handed her a letter. "What's this?" she asked. "It's from the Secretary of Defense," he said. He watched the footage. He read the reports. "He wants to meet you." She blinked, the glass halfway to her lips. "Why?" Nathaniel smiled, the first time in days. Because people like you don't just survive storms. You change weather patterns. She set the glass down and reached for his hand. For a moment, they just sat there, breathing the same air, no longer weighed down by unspoken fears. We still have to go back to court tomorrow, she said. And the day after that. And the day after that. He nodded. And we will. Together. The following morning, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters were shoulder to shoulder. Cameras clicked like insects. The judge entered. The room rose. And the final statement began. Danielle stood once more. Your Honor, we request the following be entered into record. Officers Blake and Connors have admitted to altering reports, targeting civilians based on race, and failing to follow department protocol. As a result, they will face full administrative discipline, loss of all law enforcement credentials, and are currently under federal investigation for civil rights violations. A hush fell. Then the judge spoke. This court accepts the motion. Final sentencing to follow. Outside, the air was different. Crisp. Charged. Reporters surged forward, microphones outstretched. Mrs. Harris, how does it feel to finally be heard? Tamika paused, looked out at the crowd, and said simply, it feels like the beginning. A young woman in the crowd whispered to her friend, she changed everything. But in that moment, as the courthouse doors closed behind her, Tamika wasn't thinking about change. She was thinking about Imani. About the day she would explain to her daughter how her mother didn't just fight back, she fought forward. And won. In the days that followed the courtroom upheaval, Ferguson became a different kind of battlefield. Not one marked by sirens or confrontation, but by tension so thick it folded into every hallway, every council meeting, every hallway conversation in City Hall. There was a deep discomfort among the old guard, officials and officers who had kept silent for years, clinging to their pension tracks and reputations like lifeboats. And now, the tide had changed. The headlines no longer centered on protests or property damage. They focused on depositions, accountability, internal leaks, and the question that could no longer be silenced: how many people had been harmed under the weight of a uniform and a badge? Tamika had become the reluctant face of something larger than herself. Her phone rang constantly, calls from legal teams in other states, interviews from national media outlets, messages from mothers, teachers, college students who saw in her a mirror they had tried to forget. But there was no euphoria in it. The truth had come to light, yes, but it came with the heaviness of knowing that for every person who stood beside her, there were dozens more still afraid to speak, still living with the shame of a mugshot they didn't deserve, a memory they couldn't erase. At home, the energy was a fragile calm. Imani had started asking more questions. What does civil rights violation mean? Why did the police hurt you? Why didn't anyone stop them sooner? Tamika answered carefully, refusing to wrap complex pain in neat, sanitized explanations. She told her daughter the truth. That sometimes systems break. That sometimes people fail to see your worth. But that no one has the right to take away your dignity. Not ever. Meanwhile, the legal web stretched. With Blake and Connors formally removed from duty and under federal investigation, the case against the Ferguson Police Department expanded. Whistleblowers began stepping forward, quietly at first, through encrypted messages and legal intermediaries. An anonymous detective revealed that years of internal complaints had been rerouted or buried. A city clerk leaked emails where high-ranking officials laughed off public outcries as PR headaches. Danielle built her case brick by brick, compiling a federal class action suit that named not just individuals, but a culture. A culture that had, for too long, allowed prejudice to be masked as procedure. The mayor requested a private meeting with Tamika. They met in a sterile office, fluorescent lights humming above. He was younger than she expected, worn down not by age but by the burden of too many choices made in the name of convenience. He didn't apologize outright. Not at first. Instead, he offered bureaucratic empathy, words like unfortunate, regrettable, corrective action. Tamika listened, her expression neutral but impenetrable. When he finally asked what she wanted from the city, she didn't hesitate. "I want an independent review board. Civilian-led. With the power to discipline, not just suggest. I want body cams on every patrol, with third-party monitoring. I want public data on every stop, every arrest, every citation. And I want it before another person ends up on the hood of their own car wondering if they'll make it home." He blinked, caught off guard by her clarity, by her demand not for revenge, but reform. She didn't want them to hurt. She wanted them to change. And that, in many ways, was more terrifying. Nathaniel, meanwhile, found himself facing a different dilemma. As his name became increasingly associated with the case, whispers began in certain political corners. Some viewed his silence as complicity, others feared his involvement would signal a dangerous precedent, military influence in civilian justice. One of his colleagues pulled him aside during a strategy meeting at the Pentagon. "You need to be careful," the man said, tone low, words deliberate. "There are people who think you're crossing the line. They don't like that your personal life is making waves in federal circles." Nathaniel met the man's eyes without flinching. "If standing up for my wife and exposing a broken system is a problem for this office, then maybe the problem isn't me." The man didn't reply. He didn't have to. The silence was the answer. At home, Tamika and Nathaniel started to navigate a new kind of tension, not between each other, but between their shared past and the uncertain future. There were discussions late into the night. Should they leave Ferguson? Should they stay and see this through? Was it safe? Was it right? And more importantly, what message did each choice send to their daughter, to the people who now looked to them for leadership? Tamika paced in the kitchen one evening, her voice shaking, not from fear, but exhaustion. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her back turned. "I just wanted to live. Just to breathe without having to defend it." Nathaniel crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder. "And now you're helping others breathe too. Whether you meant to or not." She turned to face him. "But what if I fail? What if this dies down, and they go back to business as usual?" He held her gaze. "Then we make sure it doesn't." That's when the letters started. Handwritten. Folded. Left in mailboxes and under doors. Notes from people who had once looked away, now writing confessions. A janitor at the police station detailing what he had overheard. A retired teacher who had witnessed a stop years ago but said nothing. A city employee who had shredded reports he now couldn't forget. Each letter was a stone placed at the foundation of something real. Something irreversible. But not everyone was grateful. Anonymous threats increased. Online hate campaigns surged. A smear article accused Tamika of exaggerating her trauma for political clout. One evening, someone spray-painted "liar" across their garage door. Imani saw it first. The girl didn't cry. She just stared at it, then walked back inside. That night, Tamika knelt beside her bed, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. "Does it scare you?" she asked. Imani shook her head. "No. It makes me mad." Tamika nodded slowly. "Me too." At school board meetings, town halls, church forums, Tamika began to speak. Not with rehearsed speeches, but with raw honesty. She talked about what it meant to be targeted without cause. To be silenced. To be questioned in your own skin. And slowly, the community changed. People who had once dismissed her as dramatic or angry began to listen. Not all, but enough. Enough to start new conversations. Enough to demand new policies. Enough to make old systems tremble. Still, there was a question that haunted her, one that Danielle brought up during one of their case reviews. If we push this too hard, they'll start negotiating settlements. Gag orders. Quiet payouts. That's how they avoid admitting guilt. Tamika leaned back in her chair. Then we don't settle. Danielle hesitated. That means a longer fight. More exposure. More risk. Tamika's answer was quiet but absolute. If I wanted quiet, I would have stayed in that car and never made the call. But not all risk was legal or physical. Some of it was emotional. Blake and Connors had requested a final statement before sentencing. A plea for leniency. The judge allowed it. The courtroom was filled once again. Blake went first, his voice hollow, rehearsed. He spoke of procedure, of fear, of training. Of how he never meant for things to go this far. Tamika watched him, unreadable. Jared followed. His words were shorter, broken. I didn't think about what I was doing. I just did what I'd always seen done. That doesn't make it right. I know that now. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting to see if Tamika would respond. The judge turned to her. Would you like to speak? Tamika stood, her voice even. I have no interest in your apologies, she said, not cruel, just clear. But I hope you mean what you said. And I hope you carry that shame for the rest of your lives. Because every person you put in cuffs for no reason still carries it. And some of them never got the chance to speak like I did. She didn't look back as she sat down. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with cameras, microphones, curious bystanders. But Tamika didn't stop. She walked straight through them, holding Imani's hand in one and Nathaniel's in the other. A woman stepped forward, quietly handing her a note. No name. Just one sentence, because you stood up, I finally can too. And in that moment, Tamika understood. The fight wasn't over. But something had shifted. And the next chapter was no longer hers to write alone. In the weeks that followed, the city of Ferguson began to shift in ways that no one could have predicted. The legal battle had cracked something open, not just in the system, but in the people. Conversations that once felt impossible now took place in churches, barber shops, classrooms, even grocery store lines. And while change didn't come in waves, it came in steady, deliberate ripples. Tamika watched this happen from a distance, often in moments of stillness between chaos. From her kitchen window, she'd see neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now pausing to greet each other, exchanging stories about the first time they'd felt afraid of those who were meant to protect them. She saw her daughter come home with questions, real questions, about justice, history, power, and watched her ask them without fear. That, more than anything, reminded Tamika that what had begun in humiliation was now unfolding into something more permanent, something generational. But peace never comes without complexity. There were moments when she questioned everything. In the quiet hours, when the media had gone home, when the protests were silent, when the adrenaline had worn off, she would sit with a journal in her lap, pen in hand, wondering whether the impact she had made would last. And there were nights when Nathaniel sat beside her, not with answers, but with silence that felt like safety. He could read her better than anyone. One evening, as they lay in bed, his hand resting gently over hers, he spoke softly into the dark, "You don't have to hold it all by yourself, you know." She didn't respond immediately. She stared at the ceiling, trying to find words. Sometimes I wonder if I became the thing I was trying to fight. The symbol. The movement. I never asked to carry it. I just wanted to breathe. He turned toward her, his voice steady. You didn't become anything, Tamika. You revealed what was always there. Strength doesn't mean you don't feel the weight. It means you refuse to drop it. Those words stayed with her, especially when the city council asked her to speak at the unveiling of the new Civilian Oversight Board, a board that she had demanded into existence, now staffed with diverse, community-appointed citizens trained to monitor law enforcement conduct. The invitation arrived in a formal letter, typed and sealed, but what mattered to her was the handwritten note at the bottom, "We wouldn't be here without you." She debated attending. Public appearances always came with risk. The stares. The whispers. The weight of expectation. But in the end, she chose to go, not to be celebrated, but to witness something she had once believed was impossible. The day of the ceremony was warm, sunlight brushing the courthouse steps where so much of her story had unfolded. The crowd gathered slowly, activists, families, pastors, teachers, people who had been watching, waiting, hoping. Tamika wore navy blue, simple and powerful, her hair swept back, her daughter at her side. When she stepped to the podium, she didn't deliver a speech rehearsed in front of a mirror. She spoke from the ache in her chest and the fire in her gut. "We were told that the system works if you follow the rules," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a hymn. "But the truth is, the rules were never written with all of us in mind. We didn't ask to be activists. We became them because silence was killing us." Her eyes swept the crowd, locking onto the faces of those who nodded, eyes wet with understanding. "This board isn't justice. It's just the beginning of what justice might one day look like. And it only exists because people demanded more than apologies. They demanded change." Afterward, dozens approached her, some to shake her hand, some just to look her in the eyes and say thank you. A woman in her 60s held Tamika's face in her hands, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You gave me back my voice," she whispered. Tamika hugged her, tightly. She didn't have to say anything. That moment said it all. But not every consequence came with applause. The smear campaign against her gained traction online. Fake headlines. Doctored videos. Forums filled with venom. Nathaniel warned her to stay off social media, but she read every comment, every thread. It wasn't masochism. It was strategy. She needed to know what they were saying. Because knowing meant understanding. And understanding meant power. Still, there were nights when she broke. One evening, alone on the back porch, the noise of the world behind her, she let the tears come without shame. Monica joined her quietly, sitting without a word, then finally said, "I know it's hard. But I also know this, every time they try to erase you, you get louder." Tamika laughed through her tears, bitter and beautiful all at once. "I don't want to be loud anymore," she whispered. Monica smiled softly. "Then don't be. Just keep being clear." Meanwhile, the federal investigation into Blake and Connors had unearthed deeper rot. There were links to other departments, internal cover-ups, ties to training seminars that normalized aggressive policing tactics in minority neighborhoods. When the DOJ released a public report, the conclusion was brutal: systemic failure. The fallout was swift. Officials resigned. Policies were rewritten. A task force was launched. Ferguson was no longer just a headline. It was a case study. And in the middle of it all, Tamika remained steady, not because she didn't feel the quake of it, but because she had learned to stand in shifting ground. And then came the invitation she never saw coming. A university in Washington, D.C., asked her to be a guest lecturer for a seminar on community justice and systemic reform. At first, she declined. Public speaking wasn't her passion. Her voice, though strong, came from lived experience, not academic theory. But Nathaniel said something that changed her mind. "You keep saying you didn't ask for any of this. But maybe that's exactly why you should be the one teaching it." She looked at him, eyes narrowing. "You're really good at pushing me out of my comfort zone." He smiled. "I've had practice. And you're better when you're uncomfortable." She agreed. Not for the prestige, but for the chance to speak directly to the people who would one day hold power. And when she walked into that lecture hall, filled with students eager to dissect theory, she began not with a quote or a statistic, but with a question. "What does justice feel like?" she asked. The room fell silent. Not what it looks like. Not what it's supposed to mean. What does it feel like in your body? In your breath? In your skin? And as the discussion unfolded, Tamika realized something profound. She was no longer just reacting to injustice. She was redefining what justice could be. From pain. From truth. From presence. Back home, life settled into something resembling rhythm. Imani returned to school with confidence, her voice louder, her questions sharper. Nathaniel continued his work with renewed purpose, his name now tied to a movement far more personal than any military mission. And Tamika, still scarred but unshaken, stood at the center of it all, not as a martyr, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had refused to be silent. Her mornings were quiet again. Coffee brewed. Laundry folded. The ordinary had returned. But beneath it pulsed something new. A clarity. A readiness. Because the system had been challenged, yes. But it was not yet broken enough. And if they were going to fix it, not just in Ferguson, but everywhere, they needed more than laws. They needed memory. And Tamika carried that memory in every step, every word, every breath. And still, there was one final piece yet to fall into place. One unresolved matter that no one dared speak of out loud, but that hovered over every meeting, every courtroom, every late-night phone call. Because while Blake and Connors had been removed and exposed, a quiet rumor had started spreading. That other officers knew more. That someone in a leadership position had enabled them. That the true root had yet to be pulled. And Tamika had a name. A face. A file. She just hadn't said it. Not yet. It started with a name written in the margin of an old file, faint pencil, almost erased. A name Tamika had seen before but hadn't given weight to, not until it kept appearing across multiple internal complaints, tied not as the main actor but as the approving signature, the final authority. Captain Wallace Granger. His name was never on the front lines of the violations. He didn't drag anyone from cars or falsify field reports. But he signed off on every single one. He authorized the patrol patterns that placed aggressive officers like Blake and Connors in black neighborhoods at peak hours. He rerouted complaints internally, blocking them from ever reaching review boards. And, as one anonymous source revealed, he ran monthly briefings that weren't about safety, they were about dominance. Granger wasn't sloppy. He was calculating. And that made him far more dangerous than any brute with a badge. For weeks, Tamika carried the knowledge of his presence like a stone in her chest, unsure how to proceed. Exposing Blake and Connors had been about justice. But going after Granger, it was about power. Institutional. Deep-rooted. Protected. She brought it to Danielle first, laying out the documents, the reports, the connections. Danielle's face tightened as she read, eyes narrowing into focus. "This isn't circumstantial," she said, flipping through timestamps. "This is orchestration. He didn't just know. He directed it." Tamika nodded slowly, her voice low. "He was the architect. The rest were just following blueprints." Danielle sat back in her chair. "Then we take it to the DA." But Tamika stopped her. "Not yet. If we rush this, he'll cover his tracks. We need to catch him off guard, same way we did the others." Nathaniel was more direct. When Tamika showed him the file, his entire demeanor shifted. "I've met this man," he said, voice cold. 2 years ago. Community Police Coordination Conference. He smiled like he meant it. Talked about reform like it wasn't a joke. But his eyes didn't match his words. Tamika looked up. "Do you think he's still pulling strings?" Nathaniel didn't blink. "I don't think he ever stopped." For the first time in weeks, Tamika felt the familiar burn of fury rising in her chest, not the blind kind that demands instant action, but the slow, deliberate fire that builds with intention. She wasn't going to react. She was going to plan. The next step wasn't legal. It was personal. Tamika asked for a meeting. Not through lawyers, not through the media, but directly. A letter, hand-delivered to Granger's office. She knew it was a risk, but it was a calculated one. She wanted to look into his eyes. Wanted to see if the monster she imagined matched the man behind the desk. To her surprise, he accepted. They met in a neutral location, an old municipal building used for mediation, neutral territory for high-stakes conversations. The room was plain. 2 chairs. 1 table. Fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Tamika arrived first. When Granger entered, she didn't stand. He was tall, clean-shaven, his uniform pressed to perfection. But his expression was unreadable, neither defensive nor remorseful. Just still. He sat across from her, folding his hands, waiting. She didn't waste time. "You know why I asked to meet," she said, her voice calm. "I know what you did. I have the files. The approvals. The reports." Granger didn't flinch. "Then why not go straight to the press?" Tamika leaned forward. "Because I wanted to see if you were man enough to admit what you are." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I followed protocol." She shook her head. "No, you created it. You trained them. You protected them. You buried victims under paperwork and called it order." He looked at her, eyes finally shifting, revealing something darker. "You think you're changing something. But all you're doing is moving pieces. The board stays the same." That sentence hit her like a cold slap. Not because it shocked her, but because it confirmed everything she feared. He wasn't just complicit. He believed in the system he upheld. Believed in its hierarchy. Its cruelty. Its silence. Tamika stood, her voice low and cutting. "That board you're so sure will never change. I'm not just moving pieces. I'm flipping the whole damn table." Granger's eyes narrowed. "Do what you have to do. But be careful. People like you start strong and burn out fast. You think you're untouchable because of your husband, because of the cameras. But public attention is a spotlight, not a shield. And spotlights fade." Tamika didn't respond. She walked out, heart pounding, knowing exactly what needed to happen next. Back in Danielle's office, she laid it all out. The meeting. His words. His threat. Danielle paced the room, furious. "He's daring us to come for him. He thinks he's insulated. He's not." They worked through the night, connecting dots, building timelines. By morning, they had enough to file a formal complaint. But Tamika wanted more than paperwork. She wanted truth. So, she recorded a message. Not for the courtroom. For the community. A video. No makeup. No filter. Just her, sitting in her living room, eyes steady on the camera. She told the story not from beginning to end, but from the wound. What it felt like to be silenced. How injustice didn't always come with fists, but with signatures. With authority. The video went viral. Not because it was dramatic. But because it was honest. Real. Unflinching. People watched and wept. People shared and remembered. And the pressure mounted. Granger tried to respond, issuing a vague statement about procedural integrity, but no one bought it. Not anymore. The public demanded a hearing. The city council caved. An investigation was launched. And within days, a subpoena followed. Inside the official proceedings, Granger was combative. Denied everything. Claimed ignorance. But every answer was met with documentation. Emails. Logs. Witnesses. One after another, former officers came forward. Told of meetings where Granger encouraged aggressive patrol. Advised them to be decisive with non-compliant individuals. None of it was overtly racist. It never is. That's how it hides. But the pattern was unmistakable. And the jury of public opinion had heard enough. Outside the courthouse, Tamika stood with Nathaniel and Imani, facing reporters. One asked, "Do you believe this ends here?" Tamika smiled, weary but resolute. "It never ends here. But this is a start." Another voice called out, "What would you say to Captain Granger if he were listening now?" She paused. Looked out at the crowd. That silence doesn't protect you anymore. The investigation didn't just lead to Granger's forced resignation. It triggered a statewide audit of police departments. Trainings were suspended. Oversight expanded. Ferguson was no longer alone. It was a spark, lighting fires in precincts that had long gone unchecked. But even in victory, Tamika felt the weight. She carried every story, every face, every name that had come forward. And she knew more would come. That was the cost of truth. One night, long after the house had gone quiet, she sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, the air cool against her skin. Nathaniel joined her, a steaming mug in his hand. They didn't speak at first. Just watched the stars, listened to the hum of distant traffic. Then he turned to her, his voice soft. "Do you regret it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. I regret not doing it sooner." He nodded. "Then we did something right." She leaned against him. "We're not done." He kissed the top of her head. "I know." Inside, Imani had left a note on the fridge. Written in marker, childish but powerful, "My mom is a superhero." And in that moment, Tamika didn't feel exhausted. Or broken. Or afraid. She felt ready. Because the truth had found its voice. And it would never go quiet again. The final chapter of this journey didn't arrive with a grand announcement or dramatic closure, but rather with a series of quiet, deliberate victories that stitched themselves into the fabric of something lasting. Captain Wallace Granger, once untouchable, was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and gross negligence of duty. As part of a plea deal, he surrendered his pension and agreed to cooperate in the ongoing federal probe into misconduct within multiple departments across the state. He gave up the names of other high-ranking officials who had conspired to protect officers with repeated abuses in their records, exposing a chain of cover-up stretching farther than anyone had anticipated. He didn't leave with dignity. He left under escort, his name forever attached not to service, but to betrayal. And while some in his old circles tried to paint him as a scapegoat, the evidence left no room for myth-making. He had chosen his side long ago, and he lost. Blake and Connors, after a long and public trial, were sentenced to serve time under federal charges for civil rights violations. Their badges were stripped, their records made public, and with each appearance in court, they saw firsthand how quickly the illusion of authority fades when the truth is louder. Their attempt to appeal was denied. Public defenders replaced the high-profile attorneys who had once promised them protection. They were no longer in control, no longer the ones writing reports, they had become the cautionary tale written into every lecture on abuse of power. Danielle Rhodes, who had once been dismissed as a passionate but overreaching civil rights attorney, was now being called to speak at national conferences, advising policy reform groups, and consulted on legal standards for new legislation. Her name was associated with one of the most comprehensive community-driven legal victories in the state's history. But to her, none of that mattered as much as the friendships she forged during the process, especially the bond with Tamika. She once told her, during a quiet dinner after the final hearing, winning this case wasn't the victory. Watching you rise, watching you speak without fear, that's what changed things. Monica, Tamika's best friend and unwavering ally through every stage, had taken the experience and turned it into purpose. She launched a mentorship initiative at Imani's school, helping young girls, especially those of color, learn how to use their voices, defend their rights, and understand their worth in a world that often tries to make them small. Her sessions were filled with laughter, music, real talk, and healing. She said once, in front of a group of students, "We are not training the next generation to survive. We're teaching them to lead." Nathaniel didn't return to work in the same way. Though still a high-ranking officer, he transitioned into an advisory role focused on ethical enforcement strategies and reform programs. He became an internal advocate for accountability within the military-police intersection, using his voice and rank to make space for others who had long been ignored. At home, he was more present, softer, grounded in the knowledge that love was not just about protecting someone, it was about believing in their strength even when the world tried to break it. And then there was Imani. A young girl who had watched her mother turn pain into purpose. She carried herself differently now. Not louder, not harder, just clearer. She asked better questions in class, stood up when something didn't feel right, and wrote essays that made her teachers pause. One of her poems, written for a school contest, was titled, My Mother's Voice. It ended with a single line, "She taught me that silence is a prison, and I was born to be free." As for Tamika, she didn't become a politician. She didn't run for office. She didn't monetize her story or build a platform off her pain. Instead, she founded a foundation called Still Standing, dedicated to supporting victims of wrongful arrests, police misconduct, and racial profiling. It provided legal aid, mental health resources, and a network of resilience. Her work wasn't loud, it was consistent. It wasn't glamorous, it was necessary. And every time she stood in front of a crowd, in a classroom, in a courthouse, she reminded people that she didn't survive because she was special. She survived because she was prepared, and because a system that expected her to crumble underestimated just how much power can live inside a woman who refuses to be silenced. She still had hard days. Still woke up with the memory of cold metal against her back. But she no longer carried that memory alone. She had turned it into fuel. Into blueprint. Into legacy. And whenever someone asked her how she kept going, she would answer, because if I stop now, then they win twice. And now, to you, the one watching, listening, holding this story in your chest, I want to ask you something. How many moments of silence have you accepted because you believed speaking up wouldn't matter? How many times have you watched injustice unfold and told yourself it was someone else's battle? What would it take for you to realize that you are someone else's reason to keep fighting? This story wasn't just about one woman's suffering. It was about a system. A truth. A mirror. And if it stirred something inside you, anger, hope, discomfort, determination, then that means you're alive, aware, and needed in this fight for justice. Let this be more than entertainment. Let it be a call to action. A reminder that change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from standing. From speaking. From refusing to look away. If this story moved you, challenged you, or gave you a reason to believe again, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and become part of a community that tells the stories others are afraid to share. Stories of strength, of justice, of people who rise even when the world pushes them down. Like. Comment. Share. Because sometimes, the twist isn't just in the plot. It's in what you choose to do next.